Thomas made a list every morning for 37 years. Not a to-do list, those came later. This list was different. It was a record of everything he had accomplished the day before. He wrote it at 6:15 every morning, before anyone else was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that always went cold. The list had categories: tasks completed, problems solved, people helped, decisions made. At the bottom of each category, he wrote a number. Total tasks, 7. Total problems, 3. Total people, 4. Total decisions, 11. He never showed the list to anyone. He never talked about it. It was a private ritual, a daily accounting of his own existence. At the end of every month, he added up the numbers and wrote them into a small notebook he kept in the drawer with the bills. 37 years of lists, 37 years of numbers, 37 years of evidence that Thomas had been useful, productive, and necessary. Then he retired on a Friday in June. On Saturday morning, he woke up at the same time, walked into the kitchen, poured his coffee, sat down, and opened the notebook. And then he realized there was nothing to write. No tasks, no problems, no people waiting for his decisions. The coffee went cold, the pen stayed on the table. Thomas, who had managed 63 people and been the person everyone called when something broke, sat there with a feeling he had no words for. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't boredom. It was the terrifying discovery that when you remove the output, you can't find the person. What Thomas didn't know yet, and what I want to talk about today, is that the person was never in the output. The output was simply the noise he made while being alive. But nobody had ever told him that. So, he spent 37 years confusing the noise with the self. The Monday morning void. The first week of retirement, Thomas told everyone he was settling in. The second week, he said he was enjoying the freedom. By the third week, he stopped telling people anything. Here's a question most retirement advice never asks. What does a Tuesday morning feel like when there's nowhere to be? Not the first Tuesday. The first one feels like a reward. You sleep past the alarm. You make breakfast slowly. You think, I earned this. But somewhere around the 5th Tuesday, or maybe the 12th, something changes. You wake up. No alarm, no demands, no problems to solve. Instead of freedom, you feel untethered, like a boat that has drifted away from the dock. Not sailing anywhere, just drifting. And after a while, drifting begins to feel like disappearing. Thomas started organizing things that didn't need organizing. He rearranged the garage 4 times in 6 weeks. He alphabetized the spice rack. Thomas didn't even cook. He offered to run errands for neighbors who hadn't asked for help. Not because the errands mattered, because doing something, anything, felt safer than the alternative. The alternative was sitting in a chair at 2 in the afternoon. Nothing in his hands, nothing on his calendar, nothing to produce. Just a man, a chair, an afternoon. And somehow, that terrified him. What is it about an empty Tuesday that feels like failure? The answer isn't the Tuesday. It's the story you've been told about what Tuesdays are supposed to look like. For decades, every Tuesday had a shape. Arrive, produce, report, leave, repeat. That shape was given to you. You didn't create it, but you lived inside it for so long that when it disappeared, you mistook its absence for your own. You're not failing at retirement. You're simply detoxing from a lifetime of being measured by output. And detox almost always feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. Which brings us to the second loop. This one is so subtle you might not even recognize it as guilt. It simply feels like being responsible. Thomas's wife, Carol, retired 2 years before he did. During those 2 years, she discovered something Thomas never had. Carol could sit on the porch at 3 in the afternoon and do absolutely nothing. Not scroll through her phone, not plan dinner, not mentally reorganize the guest bedroom. She simply sat there watching the light move through the maple tree. A cup of tea would grow cold beside her, just like Thomas's coffee always had. The difference was that Carol never felt guilty about it. She simply smiled and made another cup. Thomas would watch her from inside the house. He felt something he couldn't explain. It looked like peace, but to him, it registered as irresponsibility. 37 years of measuring himself by productivity had trained his brain to believe something should always be happening. Someone should always be getting something done. When you sit down to rest, real rest, not earned rest, not "I deserve this because I worked hard" rest, what do you feel? Peace? Or the uncomfortable feeling that you're getting away with something? Most people over 60 can't answer that honestly the first time they're asked, because resting without justification feels like laziness. And laziness, in the world many of us grew up in, wasn't simply discouraged. It was treated like a moral failure. Here's a different way to see it. Rest isn't the absence of productivity. Rest is the presence of something entirely different. It's the willingness to simply exist inside your own life, without improving it, without optimizing it, without proving anything about yourself. The guilt you feel when you rest isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's an echo, an old voice, a boss who left the room years ago, but whose expectations you're still trying to satisfy. You don't need permission to rest. But if part of you still believes you do, here it is. You're allowed. That porch at 3 in the afternoon isn't a crime scene, it's the whole point. Now here's another trap. It catches people who've already learned how to rest. They've stopped measuring themselves against their old careers, but they've quietly started measuring themselves against someone else's retirement. Thomas had a neighbor named Jim. Jim retired the same year. By every outward measure, Jim seemed to be thriving. He took up woodworking. He joined a cycling group. He volunteered at the food bank every Wednesday. He mentored young entrepreneurs every Friday. Jim's retirement looked like something from a magazine. One afternoon, Thomas admitted quietly, Jim is doing retirement right. And without realizing it, he had already decided that he wasn't. Whose retirement are you measuring yours against? And here's the harder question. Did you ever actually want that retirement? The cycling club? The woodworking? The volunteering? The mentoring? Or did someone else convince you that this was what retirement was supposed to look like? Sometimes the busiest retirees are simply people who never stopped working. They just stopped collecting a paycheck. If those activities genuinely bring them joy, that's wonderful. But if they're only staying busy because they can't bear to stop producing, then retirement hasn't really begun. It's simply the same story with different scenery. You don't need a woodworking hobby to justify your existence. You don't need volunteer hours to prove your value. You don't need to become Jim. Jim gets to live Jim's retirement. You get to live yours. And if yours looks like a porch, a maple tree, a cup of tea growing cold while you watch the afternoon light, that isn't failure. It's simply a successful retirement wearing quiet clothes. Here's what I want to offer you now. We've spent a lot of time talking about the problem, but there's something Thomas couldn't see until someone pointed it out. His list never measured what mattered most. It never measured the coworker who came to him in 1994, terrified because his son was sick. Thomas sat beside him in the break room for an hour. He didn't solve the problem. He barely spoke. He simply stayed. That coworker retired years later and still talks about that hour. Thomas's list never counted it. It never measured the young woman he hired in 2002 after 7 other managers rejected her. She didn't have the experience everyone wanted. Thomas saw something no resume could measure. He trusted it. Today, she runs the department. His list never counted that either. It never measured the example he gave his daughter, not by leaving for work each morning, but by coming home every evening, by being present, by showing up for homework, dinner, difficult conversations, and ordinary Tuesdays. Even now, decades later, she still calls her father whenever something breaks. Not because he always has the answer, but because his voice reminds her that things can be fixed. None of that appeared on the list. The notebook measured tasks, problems, decisions. But the things that truly lasted were invisible. They couldn't be counted. Yet they were always the most important things he built. So let me ask you something. What did your list never measure? You spent decades building things that can't be counted. Relationships, character, wisdom, patience that only came through experience. Kindness you chose when being harsh would have been easier. Stability you provided simply by showing up, day after day, year after year. Retirement doesn't erase those things, they're still part of you. The job simply borrowed them for a while. It didn't create them, and it cannot take them away. Now we've arrived at the deepest question of all, the one underneath every other question we've explored today. Who were you before anyone paid you to be someone? Not what did you do, not what was your title, not what did people call you. Who were you? Before the promotions, before the deadlines, before anyone measured your value and productivity, you were a child. You had no resume, no references, no performance reviews. You hadn't produced anything the world considered economically valuable. And yet, no one questioned whether you mattered. Your worth wasn't something you had to earn. It simply existed. It was inherent. It was enough. What changed wasn't your worth. What changed was the story you were taught. The world slowly convinced you that your value only became visible when it came wrapped in output. Eventually, the world handed you a list, sometimes literally, sometimes only in your mind. It said, fill the list, add the numbers, prove that you matter. And you did, for decades. You became very good at it. But the list was never the source of your worth. It was simply the evidence you learned to require. Can you imagine a version of yourself that matters, even with nothing to show for it? That's not an easy question. It may be the hardest question in this entire conversation, but sit with it for a moment. The version of you that matters without producing anything, that person is still here. Quieter now, less scheduled, less defined by external demands, but still here. The real work of retirement isn't staying busy. It's learning to recognize yourself again without all the noise. Not as a former manager, not as someone who used to be useful, simply as a human being. Still breathing, still present, still capable of love, still capable of giving attention, still capable of taking a walk around the block, still capable of having a conversation that lasts 5 minutes longer than expected, still capable of making another person feel less alone. That isn't less than who you used to be. It's who you've always been. You're simply seeing that person more clearly now. About 4 months into retirement, Thomas stopped making the list. Not because he decided to, it simply faded away. One morning, he opened the notebook and realized he hadn't written anything for 3 days. The notebook was still there, the pen was still there, but the anxious need to prove he had been productive had quietly loosened its grip. He told me he never noticed the exact moment it happened. It was like recovering from a fever. You don't know the precise moment your temperature returns to normal. You simply realize one day that you feel different. So what filled the space where the list used to be? Thomas smiled. I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. The light coming through the kitchen window at 7 in the morning is different in October than it is in July. I noticed Carol humming while she reads, just a few quiet notes under her breath. I noticed the way my grandson asks questions, not because he wants answers, but because he wants to know how I think. None of those moments were productive. None of them could be counted. None belonged on a spreadsheet. But Thomas told me something I'll never forget. They were the first experiences in his adult life that he simply lived, without measuring them, without evaluating them, without trying to improve them, just lived. And that, he said, was the retirement he never knew he wanted. Not the version in magazines, not Jim's version, his own. A man who stopped counting and finally started noticing. So here's what I'd like you to do this week. Just one thing. Notice when you reach for your own list, whatever that list looks like. Maybe it's your to-do list. Maybe it's the mental scorecard that tells you whether today was productive enough. Maybe it's the quiet calculation running in the background of your mind. Notice it. Then ask yourself one simple question. Who taught me that this proves my worth? Because someone did. A boss, a parent, a culture, a world that confused productivity with personhood. And they were wrong. Not because they meant to be, because they inherited the same story. But it was still the wrong story. You were never what you produced. You have always been more than your work, more than your title, more than your accomplishments, more than your contribution. Those things were real, they mattered. But they were never the whole of you. The whole of you is still here. Quieter perhaps, less scheduled, less defined by someone else's expectations, but still here. That isn't a diminished life, it's simply a life with the cover removed. So this week, give yourself permission to have one completely unproductive afternoon. Not because you've earned it, not because you deserve it, simply because you're alive. Because the porch is waiting, the light is moving through the trees, and you don't need a reason to sit there. If you recognized yourself in Thomas, or in the guilt, or in the list, leave a comment and tell us. What does your list look like? What are you learning to put down? Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this conversation helped you, share it with someone who might be wondering if they still matter. And if you'd like more conversations that help you let go of unnecessary weight instead of adding more to carry, subscribe. Until next time, take care of yourself. Because you were always more than what you produced.